This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Glynn Tonsor, K-State livestock economist, begins today's show with a cattle market update. He reviews the December meat demand monitor and what well-watched report is coming out this week. Keeping the show rolling is Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner, as he reviews what producers need to keep in mind between the very cold temperatures and now wet conditions. Aaron Hyland, Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent from Rawlins County, completes the show as he shares how agriculture and its producers are doing in the county. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week we're joined by K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Glynn, kicking off our cattle market conversation with what is cash cattle markets looking like?
Yeah, this past week was steady to up, depending on exactly what day and what market you would ask me on. AMS called fed cattle, the 5 area Friday price at $175, up just a hair for the week. AMS called the Dodge City feeder cattle market basically steady in most cases. There's a couple examples of up from the prior week. 2 of the largest volume loads, just for reference for listeners here, 419 head weighing 719 sold for $253, and then 355 head weighing 929 came in at $216. So both of those, the lighter weight one will be a little bit up on the week, the other basically steady. So steady as she goes or up a little bit was the cash market tone.
And what about for futures? Yeah,
so futures was up just a little stronger than that. So maybe we'll see some of that spill over into cash market this coming week. February live cattle closed at $178 on Friday. That's up about $4 on the week. And then March feeder cattle closed at $240, up a full $6 on the week. So steady on cash, up clearly on futures. And hopefully for those selling cattle, we'll see that spill over into an up market in cash this coming week.
Continuing to look at the cattle market, what about box beef cutout?
A little more strength there as well. Choice Friday came in right at $300, up about $5 compared to the Friday before. And then Select came in at $289, up $6 for the week before, which just tells you that's part of the pull story, right? So we had wholesale prices come up. That's what enabled some of those prices to come up this past week.
So overall, how's the cattle market doing in your opinion, Glynn?
Not major surprises. Of course, we had a pullback in the fourth quarter that a lot of sellers were not happy about. Maybe that pull down was stronger than most of us, including myself, expected. But I think overall it's doing pretty well, particularly given there's been some demand pullback, which we'll talk about beef demand here in a moment. But I think everything is shaped up for a pretty close eye on Wednesday's cattle inventory report, and we'll circle back to that in a moment.
And talking about those demands, your meat demand monitor for December is out, and January will be coming out soon.
Yeah, so you and I are having this discussion is the end of January. So it just so happens, the data I have here is now, a little over 3 weeks old, which isn't that old compared to other things, but on the survey project it is. The January data will be out most likely very early next week. But the summary for December was willingness to pay, which is our demand metric that we use in that meat demand monitor project. Quick sidebar. MDM is a large nationally representative survey project, beef and pork checkoff funded. It's been going on here at K-State for right at 4 years now. All this information is on AgManager.info. The domestic meat demand info we got in December was retail, or think grocery store for at-home consumption. Demand was up for all items in December compared to November, except for plant-based patty. So ribeye steak, ground beef, pork chops, bacon, those categories we track were up, which is nice. However, there was a decline in food service demand. Some of this is pure seasonality. As December goes on, there's multiple holiday gatherings, not just around Christmas, but throughout the whole month. And most holiday gatherings are at a residence, not restaurants. So you see part of that pivot. So none of that's necessarily surprising. I wouldn't overreact to it.
What about for the protein values?
Yeah, we also track the protein values. And for our listeners, the relevance of that is we're trying to give a pulse of relative importance on things that dictate what you put in the grocery cart or what main entree you buy when it comes to protein. So we present a list of 12 things: price, taste, safety, long list, environmental impact is on that list. And we ask folks which 4 are most important to your protein purchasing decision, which 4 are least, and of course the 4 others are intermediate. So this is a forced rank. You can't tell me all 12 things are the most important thing to you. You can only pick 4 that are most. And again, in December, and I like to highlight this because it's a consistent theme, taste, freshness, price, and safety are the most frequently picked, most important items, and narrowly price throughout all of 2023 ranked higher than it did the first 3 years of this project. And that's not surprising to me because we're going to talk household finances and sentiment here in a minute. But a watchful eye on the price of products for a large share of the public grew as 2023 progressed, and that was still the case as 23 concluded back in December.
What are you seeing for household finances looking at the meat demand monitor?
Yeah, so we use some questions that are also asked in the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index, and those show up in the general media all the time. That project's been going on for over 40 years. So this is a fairly new survey project. That one at Michigan's got 40 years of history to it. And consistent with both of those survey efforts have found household sentiment financially, their household finances, were pretty poor throughout 2023. And one number to really drive that point home is in December of 23, only 14% say their household finances were in better shape than they were a year earlier. That's a very small number. 42% said worse, and the balance said the same. So back to my point on price importance, if only 14%, are kind of more comfortable with their finances than a year before, the remaining, right, 86% are the same or worse. It's not surprising that there's, kind of an eagle eye on price of all products. I don't think that's unique to meat in any way, but that definitely set the tone for tighter conditions in the household budget as we start off here in 2024.
And in households, what meat are they most likely to be eating?
So in aggregate, chicken remains the most frequently consumed, but the part that's most relevant here is how does your consumption rates differ based upon your financial sentiment? And the punchline is beef, pork, and chicken are consumed way more frequently, so prior day inclusion in your meals was way higher, not surprisingly, if you tell me that your finances have improved. And to give you a specific example, let's just use the beef number. If you told me your finances improved compared to a year ago, you had 0.83 meals yesterday that had beef in it. So not quite 1 of 3 meals had beef in it. So 0.83 is an average across over 2,000 people. Conversely, if you tell me your finances have worsened, which is 42% of the public, you had only 0.67. So that might not sound like a big number, but the difference between 0.83 and 0.67 multiplied by a country of over 300 million people, it matters. And then the same trend, directional impact, occurs for pork and chicken as well. That's not surprising. We expect to see this. Meat protein tends to be one of the more expensive food categories, and it's what we call a normal good. Economists call it normal in the sense that if your economy, your at-home finances are improving, your demand for a product goes up. If your household finances are declining, the demand for that product goes down, and that's exactly what these bar charts you and I are looking at right now tell us.
As the January meat demand monitor is coming out soon, any guesses as to what we're going to see there?
Yeah, so I'm cautiously optimistic that the sentiment is improving slowly. So we have another month where we think inflation has been lower than it was. I mean, we still have inflation, but it's not as elevated as it was. The stock market has improved. Interest rates have come down a little bit. So, there's been several things that have improved in the last 30, 90 days, depending how you want to measure it. I'm cautiously optimistic we're going to see that show up in improved sentiment. Maybe fewer people tell us January is worse than the prior January. And I think that could spill over into at least neutral domestic meat demand. And hopefully as 24 progresses, I'm of the type that aggregate finances might improve as we get toward the end, or at least second half of 2024. And hopefully we'll see that be a supporting factor, a pull-up factor on domestic meat demand. Hopefully in January we start to see a little bit, let's call it a teasing of that.
As we're talking about all these different things and talking about the economics, there are a few events coming up where people could possibly hear not only from you, but other economists in the livestock industry.
Yeah, and the first thing, which is a USDA NASS report, I'll reiterate. So, you and I are talking here on Monday. On Wednesday, on January 31st, USDA releases their January cattle inventory report. It's not just geeks like me that watch those kind of reports. This particular one will give us a national aggregate as well as state-by-state inventory look. So how many beef cows are in the country, how many beef cows are in Kansas, how many heifers have been held back, those kinds of things. What's the supply of feeder cattle outside of feed yards? I mean, there's lots of information packed into this one. The number that's probably going to be watched most is the size of the beef cow herd. The most common projection is that we have 2, maybe 2.5% fewer beef cows in January of 24 than we had in January of 23. I subscribe to that theory as well, at least 2, maybe a little bit more % decline. If that's the case, we're definitely on track to have a smaller herd. I mean, it just confirm, basically, the smaller herd as 24 goes on. And probably most importantly, would confirm we have a small number of females from which to consider holding heifers this coming summer. So even if we initiate or attempt to initiate herd expansion here in 24, I think it'll be very small. I'm looking towards the summer of 2025 when we might have some, let's call it substantial heifers pulled out of the system to initiate that herd expansion. So I don't want to speculate any further than that, but that report will get watched a lot. You noted other things, which are key state events, a little quicker here. On February 6th, the Swine Profitability Conference. Our friends over in Animal Science and Industry always coordinate that. I'm going to be coming back from Atlanta. I'm not likely to be able to make that meeting, but I am plugging it because Steve Meyer is a fellow economist of mine that most listeners here in the hog industry for sure are well aware of Steve. He is slated to give the economic outlook, and there is a lot of challenges and strife in the hog and pork industry as we speak. So I would encourage folks that are able to come and take advantage of that opportunity. A little bit further into February on the 21st, here in Westmoreland, Kansas, so just east of Manhattan. Myself, Shannon Blocker, and a couple others have a small program called Range and Replacement Heifer Management Tools. I'm going to be highlighting an Excel-based decision tool for the herd expansion decision that we have on our AgManager website. Kind of walk attendees through how to use that. I believe an online version of that meeting is going to be available as well for those that are listening that may not reside close to Westmoreland. And then Cattlemen's Day is on March 1st. I believe you probably had AJ. Somebody will be talking about that full program. But I want to put it on everybody's radar because not just because I'm going to be speaking at it, but more importantly, it's going to be a unique day for ASI. We're in the process of getting a new building. ASI is Animal Science and Industry. Sorry for the acronym. President Linton here at K-State is slated to give the kickoff talk, K-State Strategy for the Future. I think it'll be a pretty unique Cattlemen's Day. I encourage folks to join us for that. Hopefully we have a nice weather day by then. You and I were talking earlier, the weather's already nicer. It should be even better by March 1st. And then finally, March 21st in Salina, slated to speak at Mid-America Farm Expo, giving another cattle outlook. So I try to highlight just an example of some of the upcoming ones. The stuff you and I talked about earlier is the kind of things that forms the base of a full outlook talk that I'll be giving, and I look forward to seeing folks at them.
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show discussing caring about cattle in cold and wet conditions. And then to talk about it, we're joined by Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
Justin, as we've had these really cool conditions and then have transitioned into being really wet and still kind of cool, thinking about lost body condition for those livestock.
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of times is when we think about cold stress or we talk about cold stress, really we're oftentimes pretty focused on that here and now, the increase in energy expenditure and how do we mitigate some of those direct responses associated with cold stress during the event, right? And so what I kind of want to talk about today is, talk about the downstream side of that. So oftentimes, many areas of the state have received some significant snowfall, right? Now that snow is starting to melt. And so that really can create some challenging conditions in terms of mud but also the cold weather as well. So we're getting muddy at the same time. We've got these cold temperatures. And so it really starts to add up, if you will, in terms of the impacts of that it can have on cattle. You mentioned body condition score on beef cows. And I think that's one of the areas that there can certainly be some impacts. We know, and I know you covered it on the show here, but with other specialists that are out there, but, we see that increase in energy expenditure. But the downside of that is oftentimes, cows over time, if we're cold and wet, we're going to expect to see some body condition losses on those cows. And so if we think about, what's our optimum in terms of body condition score of 5 on a cow at calving, and so as we go through this winter that looks on the surface here to be pretty cold and wet, one of the things I would encourage cow-calf producers is to pay close attention to body condition score on those cows, especially as we begin to get closer to calving. Really the best time for us to intervene and maybe try to improve condition on those cows would be prior to calving, right? If we've got 45 to 60 days, which for most producers, we're certainly within that window. So we may want to consider changing our program if we've got some thin cows already. The other side of that is, we need to prepare ourselves that if we are seeing some thin cows at calving, what does that look like in terms of the upcoming breeding season, right? It's likely it's going to take longer for those cows to cycle back. And so that may be something we need to think about, especially as we give some considerations to that upcoming breeding season down the road. One of the other places that I think this shows up in terms of a cow-calf operation that we see a lot is in terms of replacement heifer development. One of the things that's become very common is low input heifer development programs. Obviously, we don't need a lot of performance or gain on these heifers to achieve those target breeding weights at breeding. And so oftentimes what happens is we've got heifers that are in a program where they're on target to gain maybe a pound, maybe a little more on an average daily gain basis per head. And so what happens as we get this implication of cold stress is that those heifers aren't able to gain as much. And so if we don't have an opportunity to get a check weight on those heifers, oftentimes what happens is as we get closer to the breeding season, we want to start our synchronization protocols and really prepping those heifers for the breeding program. And then they're a little short on weight. And so they're coming in a little lighter than what we expect them to be. And so that's an area where I would really encourage producers to make sure they take that opportunity on their replacement heifer programs to do a check weight on those heifers, maybe 45 to 60 days before that expected breeding season, so that we've got adequate time that if those heifers are a little light, we've got some additional time to change our nutrition program, maybe put a little additional gain on those heifers so that they are at those our target weights prior to breeding. The other side of that is bulls on the cow-calf side, right? So we talk about, the importance of bull management, oftentimes providing bedding for those bulls. But the other piece of that is if, we really certainly want to encourage producers to do a semen test prior to turnout after we've come through a winter like this, because as we all know, it's pretty easy to put those bulls somewhere. We tend to forget about them. We're more focused on the calves and the upcoming calving season. And so it's just really easy to overlook those bulls. So I would certainly encourage if producers are not doing that, that's something they should certainly consider after coming through a winter like this.
Justin, you've mentioned improving condition and maybe changing that feeding program, that nutrition program for that livestock. Is that producers going back to nutritionists, feeding them a little bit more, maybe changing out what they're feeding them?
In some cases, yes. As we look at that nutrition program, especially on the replacement heifers, we may want to change our program, provide those heifers with a diet that's going to support a higher level of average daily gain. As we gave in that earlier example, a lot of times those heifers are targeted in a program that may be to gain a pound per head per day. Well, if we're a little behind, we can increase the nutrition program on those heifers where they're maybe going to gain 2 pounds. And we can do that as long as we're sufficiently in advance of that breeding date for us to be able to achieve those target weights prior to breeding.
As we're talking about these cool and wet conditions, kind of something that comes with that is mud. And so what do we need to think about that when it comes to those facilities for those livestock?
Sure. I think for the cow-calf operator, one of the things that I start to think about is feeding sites. Maybe we need to consider moving where we're feeding those livestock. If we're still feeding cows out on pasture, rolling hay, just making sure that we're minimizing the damage to a particular location, or that maybe we need to come in and do some cleanup. Obviously, we know that, cattle do prefer a nice dry place to lay down. And that's both typically when cows are in extensive environments like pastures, they typically find that, but where do they tend to congregate is those feeding sites if we're feeding some hay or some other things like that. So there might be some management consideration on the cow-calf side in terms of feeding sites, and maybe looking at cleaning or relocating those if possible. As we think about the implications of mud, my mind starts to gravitate towards the growing and finishing stuff. So with mud, one of the things that comes along with mud is a reduction in performance. It doesn't really take a lot of mud to significantly reduce cattle performance, especially during the finishing phase, as little as 4 inches. So if you think about that, hoof, deep, really mud can start to impact cattle performance and reduce it by as much as 15%. As we get deeper, right, that reduction is going to go up substantially. So mud can certainly substantially impact fed cattle performance. So, in terms of a growing or backgrounding operation, I think where this starts to show up is, if we have a target marketing time for those calves, say if, we're in a system where, we'd like to market a set of 8-weight calves in March. Well, if we're colder and wet, there's some likelihood that those calves are maybe going to be a little bit lighter. So potentially reevaluating the performance of those calves relative to that optimum marketing date, I think would, certainly be beneficial to some producers, just so the fact that, maybe we do need to change our nutrition program to get a little more performance out of those calves, or just reevaluate that time of marketing. Maybe we want to delay marketing those calves if that looks feasible, to put a few more pounds on them and look at that as well. From the finishing side, we talked about those dramatic increases in performance. I said we're certainly looking at increased costs, increased days on feed. So it really starts a conversation about, well, how can you mitigate that? And I think a lot of that comes back to, can we give those cattle in that feeding facility at least a dry place to lay down? And so some of that starts well in advance of the winter months and the wet season, building feedlot mounds to where those cattle are going to get up and have a dry place to lay down, and maybe they have access to that feed bunk as well if those two are connected. The other side of that is doing our pen maintenance and making sure that those pens can drain. Oftentimes we'll go in and clear the snow out of a pen so that pen surface, it doesn't continually try to melt over the entire surface, but we've actually put that to where it can start to melt in just one concentrated area, which works really well if that pen drainage is working the way that it should. In some cases, we may also want to consider bedding cattle and putting some bedding that we can provide that if we don't have that mound surface for those cattle to have a dry place to lay down. Those are some of the things that we can do in terms of trying to mitigate the responses in terms of, the mud that we're now going to be dealing with, which based on the short-term forecast, it certainly looks like this is a weather pattern. We're going to stay wet, at least for the short term here, is what I'm gathering here in Kansas. And so it's not over yet. That's maybe the unfortunate part, right? It's been a blessing to receive some precipitation, especially in some areas that have been dry. But now we've kind of got the other side of that as we look at dealing with some of the downstream implications of what those cold and wet conditions can really create for us.
If you haven't done pen maintenance, maybe go ahead and get out there and see if there's something you can do. And if not, just try to make those animals as well fed and cared for as possible.
Yeah, I think the critical thing is that a simple box blade can do a lot. If you can get out into those pens and start to repair some of those mounds or pile some of that manure and get that drainage functioning for you, especially if we know it's going to take a while, most likely where we're at in terms of the winter, to get some of that surface of that pen to dry out. A relatively well-maintained pen surface sheds water pretty effectively, as well as keeping that drainage and stuff working for us. So, pay attention to the maintenance and get in there and, hopefully we were prepared well in advance, but we know that's always not the case. The other thing that we didn't mention here that we probably should is just that pen surface can get fairly rough. And so it's also not uncommon, especially when it freezes, to see some increased lameness in cattle as well. So those are all some things to maybe be on the lookout for as well.
Justin, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some things for producers to think about as they continue to care for their livestock in these cold and wet conditions.
All right. Thanks, Shelby.
That was Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner. If you'd like to see more from the K-State Extension Beef Cattle team, you can do so by going to ksubeef.org. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with an update from Northwest Kansas. And to give us that update, we're joined by Rawlins County Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent Aaron Hyland. Aaron, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Aaron, what is the common agriculture in your area?
We are largely an ag community, and it varies a lot of grain farming and a lot of cow-calf operations. Grain farming, the two major crops are going to be corn and wheat. Wheat's still big here, big driver of the ag economy. And livestock-wise, cow-calf is definitely the king of commercial production. We do have some purebred producers too, but not many yearlings operations. And in my county, not a lot of feeders either. There are feeders in surrounding counties, but not as much here.
And what are those crops looking like right now?
Being that it's January, we've got the wheat in. Had kind of a dry end of the year last year. The rains kind of seemed to shut off about the end of July. And so we really didn't get a great start in coming up. Some of it's pretty short. That's going to be a concern for our producers going into the spring and harvest to see if there was any damage from the cold. Because last week we had, I believe it was -18 one morning. Luckily we did have some snow cover, but we also had a lot of wind, so there was a lot of bare spots. That's definitely a concern coming into this spring, and to see how it recovers, and also to see if some of the wheat that didn't make it up before it froze does come up, or if they just go ahead and roll it over to corn or forage production. So
you mentioned you have quite a few cow-calf producers, and so as we are nearing spring, how are they feeling about calving season coming up?
I think they're feeling okay. Honestly, the snow we've had and the moisture, everybody needs that, especially after how hard 22 was for us here. But I think the ones that are getting ready to start are okay with it, and they're happy they didn't start last week. The ones last week are already ready to be done. When you're trying to save calves in that kind of weather, it's pretty tough. Funny thing is now is it's been 40s most of the time. And so now they're starting to deal with mud already. It's just going to turn around. But I guess such is the life of a livestock producer, that you got to roll with what Mother Nature does to you.
Did your producers with that really cold snap, them and their livestock, really make it through okay?
From all reports I've heard, yeah. It was tough for them, but I haven't heard of any huge losses. Like I said, most people aren't going to start calving here some of them will start here in another week. Some of them start in a month. But there's some that started early with heifers, and they've had to fight. So
how are your producers doing overall?
Overall, I think it's good. Like I said, 22 was really, really tough. I helped with FSA doing their reports for disaster declarations and calculated all the rainfall or mesonet station. And I believe we had about 9 inches in 22, and 3 of those came in September. So besides that year, everything seems a lot better after that. We had actually a fair number of producers that actually no longer have livestock because of that. Pretty much every producer had to cut back numbers, and they're slowly starting to recover. But with replacement prices right now, slow is definitely what's happening. And the pastures haven't fully recovered. I mean, we had a good start with last year, getting the grass growing and having that rain early, but there wasn't much left when growing season started last year. So everybody had to push it as hard as they could.
As we round out today's conversation, do you guys have any upcoming programs in Rawlins County?
Our next program, actually we got 2 coming up. One's virtual that anybody in the state can get on. It's a Crop Talk series that our Northwest area agents that have interest or responsibilities to work in the crop industry and the agronomy stuff, we're doing that series, and that I believe starts February 20th to be the first session. But people can find information about that by Northwest Kansas Agronomy. I believe if you can Google that, that'll get you there, the information. Or I believe we'll also have the link on our county website, and so should many of the local units. But right before that, we'll be hosting a weed management meeting on February 13th. That evening, should be getting registration info on that out pretty quick here, probably within the next week. You get that through my normal channels of social media and email and webpage and all that.
That was Aaron Hyland, Rawlins County Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent. I will link resources in today's show notes if you'd like to find more information about these upcoming events. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.